Hi, and welcome to Lecture 2. I hope you're doing okay in the class and enjoying it so far. I do know that the introductory reading is long and a bit dense, but hang in there. I just want to give you a good foundation before we launch into the literature of the period, so you know what to do with that literature, what to make of it, and how to analyze it. We're going to talk about the Modernist Manifestos. And the word manifesto, derived from Latin, means to make public. It first entered into English usage in the 17th century to describe printed declarations of belief and advocacy. You may be familiar with some current day manifestos that have been written by often radical extremists. Early manifestos tended to be weapons forged by dissenting groups in religious and political struggles, a tradition that continued into the 19th century. So when you're thinking about these modernist manifestos, and you're thinking about your QHQ, in this case you might consider a QHQ that will help you define the genre and the purpose of a manifesto. This is F.T. Marinetti, and he wrote a manifesto that you either have read or you're going to read. He was a relatively obscure Italian poet before publishing the founding and Manifesto of Futurism, which attracted an international circle of artists and writers into his orbit, including painters, architects, poets, sculptors, playwrights, and film directors. Across all the arts, Futurism scorned traditional standards of artistic beauty, celebrated modern technologies of speed, and aimed to shock audiences. While many modernist writers depicted the modern world not as a triumph of human civilization, but as an experience of loss, Marinetti wholeheartedly embraced the idea that modern technology has ushered in a secular millennium. And this is what you're going to find constantly, is this push and pull in modernism between the triumph of human civilization and technology against those who feel like it's a huge loss to the culture. You might consider a QHQ that explores Marinetti's position. In this and other sections of his manifesto, does Marinetti seem to be uncritically embracing the advances of modern technology, or is there evidence that he's more self-aware than such bombastic declarations as this would suggest? In other words, is Marinetti's vision of modern art merely a reflection of modern technology, or does the modern art serve as a commentary on the scientific and technological advances of the modern world? The 2 points from the Manifesto of Futurism reproduced on this slide represent some of the more troubling aspects of Marinetti's worldview: his celebration of war and his denigration of women. He glorifies scorn for women, and he promises to destroy feminism. Consider a QHQ that explores how his pro-war, anti-woman stance relates to his futurist philosophy. Does it seem to be an afterthought? Or are the glorification of war and the denigration of women integral to Marinetti's thinking? This is an image of Mina Loy. Mina Loy was a self-described feminist, poet, and writer, and, oddly enough, the sexual partner of the apparently anti-feminist F.T. Marinetti. She wrote, but did not publish, her feminist manifesto during her association with Marinetti. Here's another idea for a QHQ, then. Does Loy's manifesto read as a response to Marinetti's? As a criticism of it? Are the two manifestos written in a similar form? Or are there formal differences as well as differences in content? One of the most immediately noticeable features of Lloyd's manifesto is its typography. She increases the font size at strategic moments, underlines text, puts letters in boldface, and employs irregular capitalization. In a QHQ, you might explore the effects of this. Does Lloyd's message of absolute demolition, rather than mere reform, require that she radically alter the appearance of her text? That is, does the message of her text determine the form that it takes? It is also worth considering how Lloyd's militaristic language of demolition and destruction recalls Martinetti's glorification of war. But her pro-feminist message runs entirely counter to Marinetti's. How might we account for this conflict? Here's Ezra Pound. Some of you might be familiar with Ezra Pound. He was actually an American expatriate living in Europe. He was hugely influential in the circle of other expatriate writers and artists, not only for his own work as a poet, but also for the advice he offered to other writers. Retrospect is Pound's manifesto on Imagism, a school of poetry that argued for the central, if not defining, place of the image in modern poetry. And I would, on the next slide, I'll point to some particulars that he mentions in his effort to emphasize the importance of the image. An image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. It is better to present one image in a lifetime than to produce voluminous works. Use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. So as you look at these, as you think about these, ask yourself if you think Pound is offering a radical new vision of poetry, or if his comments are simply good advice for writers of any kind. What do you find radical in Pound's approach as laid out in a retrospect? This is probably Pound's most famous poem, or one of them, at least maybe the most well-known, In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Now you can think about this in terms of his ideas about imagism in how it works. So you might, in a QHQ, explore whether he practices what he preaches in retrospect in this poem. After reading the poem, are you inclined to think differently about the advice Pound offers in a retrospect? After reading an Images poem, do you think that a retrospect is offering something more than just general advice for writers? This is an image of Willa Cather, who wrote many novels, one that we're going to read later in the quarter. She was born in the Midwest, but spent most of her career as a novelist in cosmopolitan cities such as London and New York. In the novel De Meuble, Cather implicitly asks what 19th century novelists can teach 20th century writers. And in asking this question, she rejects realist novels as mere amusement and looks to American romances such as Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter for inspiration. The realist literature of an earlier tradition was committed to the verisimilitude, that is, the appearance of being true or real, that Cather here rejects. In a QHQ, explore that which Cather offers in place of verisimilitude. Discuss key phrases such as to interpret imaginatively and to present by suggestion rather than by enumeration. Here's William Carlos Williams. another very well-known poet and writer. So far, all of the other manifestos that we looked at are serious invectives. It may come as something of a shock to encounter the playfulness in these excerpts from William's Spring and All. Given the playful, ironic, and humorous tone of William's manifesto, it may be difficult to tell how serious he is about his vision for modern poetry. It might take some time to go through this excerpt to identify both William's humor and his central message about poetry. It is spring, but miracle of miracles, a miraculous miracle has gradually taken place during these seemingly wasted eons. And here, just with this language, you can see the kind of playfulness with the exclamation points, with the repetition of the word miracle. It's kind of a joy. The language from Spring and All evokes both the creation story in the book of Genesis and the theory of evolution. In a QHQ, imagine why Williams does this. And how does he make both religion and science serve the meaning of art? Does Williams really think that art is as central to human experience as science and religion are? Or is he being ironic? Or in the midst of his irony, is he absolutely committed to the importance of art? This is Langston Hughes. I'm sure you've heard of him because we learned a lot of his poetry in high school. He has a little different take on his manifesto, which might be expected because he's a man of color. Many modernist writers supported the idea that artists and writers should be fiercely committed to their personal vision, regardless of what the market, critics, or other writers said. In The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, Langston Hughes argues that an artist's racial identity complicates this commitment to personal vision in ways that white writers had not fully appreciated. There's a tension in this statement that appears on this slide between individual choice, an artist must be free to choose what he does, and a manifesto-like prescription of what African American poets must do. I am ashamed for the black poet who says. How does Hughes navigate this tension? How does he encourage black writers to embrace their heritage without telling that they must write in a certain way to be considered successful writers? How does Hughes use the example of other successful black artists, jazz musicians, novelists, poets, and artists to inspire would-be African American writers rather than to merely dictate what does and doesn't count as authentic black expression? In what ways is this essay not about art at all, but about racism and the self-hatred that it breeds in an oppressed population? All right, using the information from this slideshow, choose a manifesto to read carefully before writing your QHQ. And I say that not to dissuade you from reading all the manifestos, but to make sure that you read one carefully and take a look at the other ones. You can use any of the questions I've proposed during this lecture, or you may choose your own. Thanks for being here today.